So, let's talk about ancient Israel. We're going to dig into a really fundamental question. Who were they, really? We're going straight to the source text, the Bible itself. And you know what? The story it tells might just flip a lot of what you think you know on its head.
Seriously, take a second. When you picture ancient Israel, what pops into your head? Maybe, a bunch of people in robes wandering through the desert. Or maybe you see a big kingdom all focused on one single holy city.
Yeah, for a lot of us, the image is pretty straightforward, right? We imagine this one single group of people, ethnically pure, kind of sealed off from everyone around them, and stuck to this one little piece of land forever. It's a neat and tidy picture.
But here's the kicker. What if that simple, tidy picture isn't actually what the Bible describes at all? What if the real story, the one in the text itself, is about a people who are always on the move, always mixing with others, and living way, way beyond any one border? Okay, let's get into it.
All right, so where do we start? Well, you got to go back to the very beginning, right? To the founders of the 12 tribes. I mean, this is where Israel's whole identity gets forged. And believe me, the details in the text are, well, they're pretty eye-opening.
And just look at who we're talking about here. These are not just some random side characters. We're talking about Judah, the ancestor of the entire royal line, and Joseph, whose sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, become these massive, powerful tribes. And their mom? She was Egyptian royalty. And get this, even Moses, the guy who brings down the law from the mountain, he had wives from what we'd now call Arabia, and another from Africa, maybe Sudan or Ethiopia. This isn't a footnote. This diversity is baked into the very DNA of the story.
And the text doesn't just mention this and move on. Oh no, it leans right into it. There's this incredible moment when Moses' own brother and sister, Aaron and Miriam, start complaining about his marriage to this African woman. And what happens? God steps in directly, but not to back them up. He comes down hard in defense of Moses. So the story itself basically frames this kind of ethnic prejudice as a sin. That's a huge statement about who belongs and who doesn't.
Okay, so from the founders, let's jump forward to what is arguably the defining moment for Israel as a nation, the Exodus from Egypt. We all have that picture in our minds, right? A single unified people marching out of slavery. But the text throws in this one little detail that changes everything. A mixed multitude, that's the phrase it uses. Think about that. From the very moment they walk free, the Bible makes it clear that other people, not Israelites, were right there with them. So this whole idea of a purely Israelite group on this journey, it's just not what the text actually says. It's way more complex. And here's another key point. The group that left Egypt is not the same group that arrived in Canaan. I mean, a whole generation passed in the wilderness. The adults who left slavery didn't make it. But even beyond that, they didn't all settle in one spot. A couple of the tribes decided to set up shop east of the Jordan River, that's in modern-day Jordan. But nobody ever said, oh, you guys aren't real Israelites anymore. They were still fully part of the nation.
All right, so let's move into the era of the monarchy. You've got King David, King Solomon. This is the peak of Israel's power, right? You'd think this would be the time when they'd circle the wagons, consolidate and become more isolated. But the text shows us, nope, the exact opposite happened.
I mean, look at the big names. King David, the most celebrated king of all, had a wife from an Aramaean kingdom in modern-day Syria, and their son, Absalom, was a legitimate contender for the throne. Then you have his son, Solomon, whose court was like the United Nations of the ancient world. He had wives from everywhere: Egypt, Moab, Edom, Sidon, the Hittites, basically from all the surrounding empires in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey.
And you know that famous story about the Queen of Sheba visiting Solomon? That's not just some cool little tale. What it really shows us is that Jerusalem at this point was a global crossroads. People were traveling from Arabia or Africa to get there. So when Israel was at its most powerful, its leadership wasn't walled off. It was plugged into the entire world.
So what happens when it all comes crashing down? The kingdoms fall and the people are sent into exile. And for a lot of us, that sounds like the end of the story, right? But the text paints a totally different picture. It's not about being wiped out. It's about being spread out. A huge redistribution of the people. And the Bible is super specific about where they went. When the Assyrians took over the northern kingdom, they didn't just eliminate them. No, they moved them and resettled them all across their empire, in places that are now Iraq, Syria, and Iran. Later, the Babylonians do the same thing with the elites from the southern kingdom. All of a sudden, you have these thriving Israelite communities scattered all over the Middle East.
And this is really the key thing to understand about the Babylonian exile. It was a strategic move. They didn't just grab random people. They took the who's who, the leaders, the priests, the skilled craftsmen, basically the entire cultural and intellectual heart of the nation, and they moved it intact to Babylon. So in a weird way, this actually preserved Israel's identity, it just shifted its headquarters.
Now here's where it gets really fascinating. Decades later, when they're finally told, hey, you can go back home, you'd expect a massive flood of people returning, right? But the text shows something totally different. It was optional, and most people didn't go back. They stayed put. They'd built new lives, new communities all across the Persian Empire. And just like that, you have a permanent, thriving Jewish diaspora that was actually bigger than the community that returned to Judah.
So, when you put all these pieces together, the mixed marriages of the founders, the mixed multitude of the Exodus, the global court of Solomon, the dispersion of the exiles, it all points to one big idea. The text seems to be telling us that Israel's identity was never really about a specific piece of land or some kind of pure bloodline. It was about something else entirely.
Just let this sink in for a second. By the time of the Roman Empire, where was the largest population of Jewish people? Not in Jerusalem. It was in Alexandria, Egypt, a huge Greek-speaking city. That was the demographic and intellectual center of the Jewish world. Jerusalem was still, incredibly important symbolically, but it wasn't where the action was for most people. Their identity wasn't just surviving outside the homeland, it was thriving.
So what was it about then? Well, this is the core of it. The text points to an identity built on a covenant, a shared agreement. It was about a common set of beliefs, a shared legal and religious tradition, a collection of stories that you could pack up and take with you anywhere in the world. It wasn't about bloodline or borders. It was about belonging to a community that shared this tradition.
And this wasn't some late-stage development either. This idea was there from the very start. Right there in the Torah, in their own foundational law, there's a clear path for outsiders, for strangers, to join the community and be treated exactly the same as the native-born. The whole system was built with an open door, designed for inclusion, not to keep people out.
So that brings us to our final thought. If the Bible itself, from beginning to end, tells the story of a people who were ethnically mixed, constantly on the move, and defined by a shared covenant that anyone could join, well, how does that change the way we think about their story and what it means to be a people?